Japan was a mystery. It existed somewhere on the other side of the world, a remote and distant dream. A legendary island, Nippon, the land of the rising sun. The natives of the islands of Japan are harmless people, but they bow down to idols, as do the people of China. They worship them in their temples, where they keep paintings of them looking like devils. The citizens of Japan are fat folk, broad of face, and mostly white people. That utterly simplistic description of such a very complex and age-old society as Japan came from the mouth of Dirk Gerritson Pomp and was recorded by Jan Huygen van Linschoten. Both men came from this placid little town, Enkhuizen. As a toddler, Dirk Gerritson Pomp already thought he'd seen enough of this tiny harbor, where he would make a boat of his wooden shoe and dream of distant lands. And so he left. At the age of 11, only 3 feet tall, but no doubt a budding Marco Polo, he traveled to Portugal, from where ships sailed all over the world. As for Jan Huygen van Linschoten, he too left home at a very early age, and by way of Spain arrived in Lisbon, where he entered the service of a Portuguese archbishop. Practically on the other side of the globe, quite by chance, these two men met for the first time in Goa, in India. Dirk Gerritson Pomp had just returned from China and Japan as the first Dutchman ever to set foot in these unknown countries, and his colorful adventures were carefully recorded by Jan Huygen van Linschoten. Many years later, Dirk Gerritson Pomp returned to Enkhuizen, where his exciting stories earned him the suggestive nickname Dirk China. Jan Huygen van Linschoten too returned to Enkhuizen, where he wrote the Itinerario, a book about his travels, which became quite famous. Dirk China's stories, as well as the first voyage to the East Indies, were sufficiently inspiring for 2 enterprising merchants from Rotterdam to venture the leap into the dark. Five ships were prepared for an expedition in which our globetrotter Dirk China himself also took part as captain of one of the ships. Captain of another ship called the Love was Gerrit van Beuningen, an experienced but cantankerous character who was always at loggerheads with everybody, and as a result spent more than 8 months in chains in the hold of his ship during the first voyage to the East Indies. First mate on the Love was an Englishman, William Adams, who had been taken on by the Rotterdam merchants for his professional skill and his navigating experience. The 5 ships were baptized in the best of Christian tradition, with a ring of righteousness to their names. They were faith, truth, hope, good news, and love. On the 27th of June, 1598, this devout company blithely set out with a less God-fearing instruction to trade and plunder their way around the world and to bring back a fortune. The project soon turned into a disaster. None of the 5 ships ever completed their mission, and only one of them was ever seen home again. Even before the first rendezvous at Annobon, the admiral had already died. Gales and deprivation had already wrought dreadful havoc when 1 year later they arrived in the Magellan Strait. And there the crew died like flies from cold and hunger, despite desperate foraging trips to the mainland, where they even came to blows with monstrous crabs. During the voyage through the Magellan Strait alone, 200 men perished, a large number of them slain by hostile natives. The Faith was the first to give up the ghost, and she limped home, the only ship of the 5 ever to return. Nobody had reckoned with snow and ice, and in sheer misery, the crew had to draw on the cargo of textiles in order to supplement their summer rig. Food became so scarce that Captain van Beuningen had to keep order, cudgel in hand, during the distribution of the meager rations. 1 moldy ship's biscuit per man per day, and barely half a tankard of water. The Good News, under the command of Dirk China, was overpowered by the Spaniards while cruising along the coast of Chile. When the 6 survivors eventually returned to the homeland many years later, 3 of them found their wives married to other men. The Truth, drifting idly across the Pacific, quite incredibly managed to miss both Australia and New Guinea at the other end, and most unfortunately happened to land on Tidor, which was firmly in the hands of the Portuguese. With the exception of 1 man, the entire crew was murdered. The Hope nosed along the coast of Chile in pursuit of a rumor about a treasure island. But after landing near La Mocha, 27 men were ambushed and killed by natives. In a deplorable state, the Hope fled back to sea, where she was totally wrecked by a roaring gale. They say that 5 survivors, who managed to escape death in a small boat, ran ashore on an unknown island where they were hailed as white gods. Thus the Dutch may well have discovered the island of Hawaii, 2 centuries before the famous Captain James Cook officially claimed the credit for it. And finally, the Love. Again on the treacherous coast of Chile, this ship was suddenly attacked by natives. 22 members of the crew were killed, including Captain Gerrit van Beuningen himself. In a sorrowful state and badly damaged, the Love embarked on the Great Crossing in search of the island of Japan. It turned into a horror trip. Sail had to be reefed constantly to weather the heavy gales. The murdered captain had been succeeded by Jacob Kakernach, who hardly had a chance to enjoy his promotion. He was struck down by fever halfway across the ocean. Yet, with his last strength, he kept on dragging himself up on deck, as he was too stubborn to hand over command of his ship to that foreigner, his first mate, William Adams. But finally, Captain Kakernach had to give in. Fever and exhaustion had turned him into a human wreck, forcing him to hand over to his young mate the command, the logbook, and the secret charts. With the 9 men who could still stand, William Adams succeeded in getting the ship through the last heavy gales. It's a perfect miracle that the land which loomed out of that tempestuous night, of all countries, happened to be Japan. It was the 19th of April in the year 1600. On that 19th of April, William Adams and the survivors of the Love made the first tentative contacts between the Netherlands and Japan. In those days, Japan was a powerful, militant, feudal state of 25 million people, dominated by the shogun. The emperor, though revered as a demigod, in effect had no real power. The shogun was the military dictator who followed a policy of divide and rule in order to keep his daimyos under control. These daimyos ruled the provinces from their grand castles, like the feudal gentry in medieval Europe. In that police state, with its strict castes and ranks, the samurai were of the highest social standing. Every soldier was a samurai, from the shogun himself right down to the lowest private. Only the samurai were allowed to carry arms, and they lived in the best houses around the daimyo's castles. The much lower ranks of fishermen and farmers populated the arable coastal areas. They eked out a poor living out of tiny plots of land growing rice, most of which had to be handed over as taxes. Right at the bottom of the social ladder were craftsmen and traders. Nobody in those days could have foreseen that precisely these low-ranking citizens were to become the mainstay of modern Japan, that industrial success story of our times. Right in the middle of this world of glass and concrete, stretching up to heaven, stands the statue of a man with his own link to higher spheres, a monk, a missionary, a saint, Francis Xavier. Today, there is religious freedom in Japan, and the Catholic Church now stands unthreatened among Buddhist temples and Shinto shrines. This was not always so. For centuries, Japan was the land of Buddha, of their own Shinkoku, and of the godlike emperor. But around 1550, the Portuguese arrived, not only to trade, but especially to preach the Catholic faith. That new faith immediately struck such a responsive chord with the Japanese that the shogun felt his position threatened and unleashed a merciless persecution of the Christians. Christians in their hundreds were burned alive in these blazing sulfur springs, after being immersed time and again and mutilated with red-hot tongs and bamboo saws. Hundreds of others were simply thrown into the sea from the so-called Papist Mountain. To escape a martyr's death, they had to forswear the Catholic faith by trampling on the image of the Holy Virgin. Thousands died a martyr's death on the cross, were buried alive, or hung upside down in cesspools. 26 missionaries were killed by order of the shogun as soon as they set foot in Nagasaki. To the shogun, the Dutch were just what he needed. It was blatantly obvious how they shared his hatred of the Portuguese and their pernicious Catholic influence. Yet it took another 9 years before the first trading ships of the Dutch East India Company entered this harbor on the island of Hirado. Here, the Dutch built a large trading post, of which practically nothing remains. Figureheads from these first Dutch ships can still be seen in the Matsuda Museum. And miniature versions are eagerly bought by the many tourists. All sorts of historic places in Hirado remind us of the earliest contacts with the Netherlands. It attracts a great number of sightseers and school children who can follow the trail back on a large plan. One of these trails, having stood the test of time, leads to what is known in Hirado as the Dutch Wall. The steps along this wall lead to yet another historic monument, the grave of a red barbarian. It's the grave of William Adams, first mate of the Love, who won not only the trust of the shogun, but even his friendship, because Adams initiated him into the secrets of Western navigation and shipbuilding. Anjin-san, or pilot, is what he was called in Japan. One single flower on his grave, a sign, perhaps, that he is not completely forgotten. To secure the water supplies in times of tension, the Dutch always dug their own wells within the precincts of their settlements. In Hirado, too, they dug a well right next to the trading post, which today is another point of interest for sightseers. These are the Dutch steps, which together with the Dutch wall and the well are about all that is left of the Dutch period in Hirado. In the Netherlands, few people would bother to look at these things. But in Japan, tourism is a national pastime, and thousands of people come here every year. For 30 years, Dutch ships came regularly to Hirado carrying porcelain from China, silk, sugar, deerskins from Taiwan, Dutch linen, wool, and cotton. And these goods were exchanged for Japanese gold, silver, and copper. The Dutch usually made profits of around 100%, despite competition from the Portuguese, the English, and the Japanese themselves. The relationship between the Dutch and the Japanese was never relaxed or easy. They were involved in a difficult competitive battle, in a completely alien culture, full of mysterious customs and traditions. One single mistake, a gesture, a word, could instantly destroy all that had been achieved. And many mistakes were made in a world where everything still depends on precision and refinement. Be it the jousting game of eloquence or the arrangement of flowers, yes, even the simplest task in a fish shop bears witness to this tradition. What's so special about this average-looking fish shop in Hirado? It's the location where in 1640, François Caron, one of the most capable managers of the Dutch trading post, cemented the fragile relationship between the Netherlands and Japan by an act which seemed to cut across all commercial instinct. At that time, the political situation was very tense. The new shogun, getting fed up with rebellious Christians and incessant squabbling between rival merchants, declared Japan a closed country. No Japanese were allowed out of the country, and no foreigner allowed in. It was exactly on this spot that François Caron was given the order to destroy his own trading post to the last stone. And indeed he obeyed. He hired a number of Japanese, and together with the Dutch, they demolished the whole thing, all except this wall, which was left standing, and is now an interesting feature in this fish shop. For the Dutch, it was all over in Hirado. Yes, the Dutch East India Company was about to be thrown out of Japan, like all the other foreigners. But the prompt and honorable obedience of François Caron earned him the respect of the shogun and saved the vulnerable relationship between Holland and Japan. Mutual respect formed the bridge between the two nations, even under the most strained circumstances. The Dutch had to invoke all possible tact, diplomacy, and tolerance to secure step by step their foothold in Japan. Men like Caron, able to make a quick decision and gifted with intuition, were the key to the successful developments. By the grace of the shogun, the Dutch were allocated a settlement on the very edge of Japan, in Nagasaki, where most of the bay has now silted up and has become a building site. 3 centuries ago, it looked like this. The harbor was 3 times as large. There, the Dutch were allowed a place, not on the sacred Japanese soil itself, but on an artificial offshore island called Deshima. It had really been built for the Portuguese, but they had been thrown out of Japan within 2 years. The island was fan-shaped, but today's tourist will find no more than a plan and a few details, describing, for instance, the area of the site, only 13,000 square meters, chock full of buildings, and the most important dates. 1636, the year it was built, and 1641, when the Dutch started their long residence there. The old Deshima was surrounded on all sides by water and a wall, part of which is still standing in reasonable condition and treasured as an historic monument. The only connection between Deshima and the mainland was a bridge, of which a replica has been built. No Dutchman was allowed to cross this bridge without special permission, and conversely, Deshima was out of bounds to the Japanese citizen. Only official interpreters, guards, and sentries were allowed in. The Dutch ships coming to Deshima were armed to the teeth, usually some 25 heavy cannons to one ship, products of the Dutch arms industry, which was thriving in those days. These cannons inspired great awe in the Japanese, and initially they had to be removed, together with sails and rudders, from any Dutch ship anchoring off Nagasaki. Not an easy job, considering the weight of these things. And of course, one of them disappeared into the bay, straight through the bottom of a Japanese junk. The crew of the junk were beheaded on the spot, and the cannon wasn't salvaged until they dug it out of the mud in 1933. Now it is, needless to say, a tourist attraction.
In
the Netherlands, hardly anyone has ever heard of Deshima, but 99 out of 100 Japanese can tell you about it. Every school child learns all about the love and trading post in Hirado and the Dutch residence on Deshima. After all, for more than 2 centuries, Holland was the only foreign nation allowed to do business in Japan. Why only the Dutch and not the Portuguese or the Spanish? Because the Dutch respected the Japanese laws and were prepared to compromise, yes, even to lick the dust in order to safeguard their purses. The Japanese were very keen on silk for the making of kimonos, and especially in the early days, silk constituted the bulk of their imports. It was bought in China, but that wasn't always easy. If supply threatened to fail, a Dutch captain would not hesitate to tackle a Portuguese trading ship or a Chinese junk on the open sea and relieve them of their precious silk cargo, which was then respectably sold in Japan. Today, Japan is completely self-sufficient as far as silk is concerned. The designs on the kimonos are still mostly hand-printed and preferably dried in the sun on wooden boards, which are placed outside as soon as the sun appears. Traditionally, the dyes should be rinsed out in an open river, but environmental regulations no longer allow this. However, they cannot do without their tradition, and so artificial streams have been made inside the workshops. Apart from gold, silver, and copper, porcelain was becoming more and more popular in Europe. The large trading companies even had it especially made for royal households and other rich customers, the so-called Japon de commande. The Dutch East India Company, too, had its own series of blue plates made in Japan. As in Hirado, the profits made on Decima were phenomenal, but the circumstances under which they had to live were not exactly ideal. The Dutch tricolour was hoisted faithfully every day on Decima, but in fact the artificial island was nothing more than a kind of state prison where nobody was allowed on or off. Within the walls of Decima, there were never more than about 20 Dutchmen, under the leadership of their head merchant, known as the chieftain. These 20 lived defenseless and isolated under the ruthless protection of no less than 200 Japanese, mainly interpreters and guards, whose main task it was to defend Japan against any influence from foreign vices and unhealthy ideas. Religious books were strictly forbidden, as the Japanese were scared to death of anything which smacked of Christianity. As soon as ships arrived, their Bibles were confiscated and kept in a sealed barrel until the ships put to sea again. They were never allowed to berth a decima anyway, but had to anchor at a safe distance, while Japanese lighters would shuttle the cargoes to and from the shore. Gradually, a special art developed. The Nagasaki air prints of Dutch ships with the VOC sign of the Dutch East India Company. But the Japanese artists seem to have had some difficulty with this sign, since they usually painted it upside down. Perhaps they regarded the V as the circumflex used in many Japanese characters. But with those few Dutch ships arriving each year, inevitably more and more of the Western culture, ideas, and especially science came seeping through into Japan. This happened mainly through the Japanese interpreters, who learned Dutch with the aid of the few books available, such as ship's journals, books on anatomy, medicine, botany, and wildlife. And so, after a while, the first Japanese-Dutch dictionaries appeared. The Japanese were allowed to search the houses of the Dutch. Every step, every word, every gesture was noted by the guards, who were consequently referred to by the Dutch as snoopers. To this day, the reports of the Dutch chieftain are read in Dutch by Japanese, translating these age-old documents into their own language. Snoopers could come onto the island, and they were at liberty to enter a house without any warning. The governor warned me that this could happen by day or by night. I thank the governor for that friendly warning, but told him that there was nothing in our houses which could not be seen by all Japanese.
De vernieuwers voor die vriendelijke waarschuwingen bedanken. En tevens zeggen, wie het ook was gerust in alle onze woningen mocht komen, dat niet in was, of het mocht door alle Japanners gezien worden.
The Dutch, not being allowed one step outside Deshima, lived amongst the warehouses and in the narrow alleyways of those jam-packed few acres the whole year round. 20 men among 200 Japanese, who even drew their full salary from the Dutch East India Company. But once a year, a small number of Dutch were given permission to stretch their legs on real Japanese soil. For once a year, a costly journey was made to the court in far-off Edo, which is today known as Tokyo, merely for the purpose of paying homage to the shogun and conveying gifts. The journey covered half Japan. The first destination was Osaka, at the other side of the inland sea. In Osaka, the Dutch would behold their first Japanese wonders, such as the magnificent castle of the daimyo, which according to one Dutchman, took as much as an hour to circumvent. This castle was built out of granite blocks of unbelievable size and weight. These blocks had been transported between two ships underwater across the inland sea to Osaka. In this castle, you'll find an old cannon of the Dutch East India Company, preserved in a glass cage like a relic. From Osaka, they would march on to nearby Kyoto, a magic city full of magnificent temples, all equally breathtaking. In this Kiyomitsu temple, built on high piles, there's a number of votive paintings donated to the temple by Japanese ship owners to implore a safe passage for their vessels. Amidst the Japanese, you see a red barbarian, Jan Jakobsson Visser. He's the pilot who, together with Abel Tasman, was later to discover Australia. From Kyoto, the procession moved along the Tokaido in strictly prescribed order. First the cooks and writers, then the official guides, the tour conductor, bearers with trunks loaded with money and gifts, then the Dutch chieftain carried in a litter, Japanese interpreters, and Dutch employees from the trading post, the Dutch doctor, and finally a high-ranking officer also carried in a litter. The Tokaido, hundreds of miles long, was paved with large flagstones, with some parts of the track pleasantly shaded by high trees. Long stretches of the road, however, were very narrow, which meant that the procession of hundreds of people, with litters, horses, servants, and soldiers, would stretch out into a giant snake, meandering at a speed of about 20 miles a day through the rolling hills of the coastal region and across rivers and mountain passes. The Tokaido is the oldest traffic artery between eastern and western Japan. There was always a terrific bustle, with processions passing each other, daimyos with their retinue on their way to the shogun, peddlers, beggars, and pilgrims, and the road was lined with tea houses, brothels, and inns. In Edo, now Tokyo, and the center of power even in those days, was the highlight of the whole glittering tour, an audience with the shogun. The audience entailed mainly that the Dutch chieftain would crawl across the room on all fours, let his head touch the ground, and crawl back again. Such honor was not even always bestowed on the daimyos. The Dutch used to bring very expensive gifts every year to the value of some 15,000 guilders of those days. Some of these gifts are still regarded in Japan as national treasures. One such treasure is a copper chandelier with 30 arms, which had to be carried along in pieces, indeed, a masterpiece of Dutch copper casting. When this showpiece was assembled, a sudden panic struck as the emblem of the shogun with which the chandelier was adorned appeared upside down. Everybody held his breath. A small blunder like this could mean on-the-spot decapitation. But the shogun was so impressed with the copper casting that he affably decided to ignore the mistake. The Japanese were equally accommodating in respect of one of the basic needs of the Dutch men. On the old entry gate, now provided with a coat of arms of the Dutch East India Company, there used to be a different sign, reading, "No females allowed, except prostitutes." The Dutch could not bring their wives with them, and Japanese girls had no chance whatsoever of coming into contact with the red barbarians in their weird clothes and with their duck's feet, as they were usually described. But the Japanese did allow prostitutes on Deshima. The relationship between the Dutch and these Japanese prostitutes is still portrayed in a traditional festival dance, full of erotic symbolism, such as the kimonos with very low-cut necklines, as only worn by prostitutes, and by the Dutchman's stick being grasped by the Japanese girl. It's obvious that during these relationships, the odd accident could occur, but the children who were the result of this remained the possession of the prostitutes, although the Dutch, of course, had to pay for their upbringing. For some reason, these alliances between the Dutch and their kese, the Japanese word for prostitute, earned these men a legendary reputation in Japan as sexual athletes and learned specialists in the erotic arts. In practice, however, there was much more to it than just a paid opportunity to satisfy what used to be referred to as randy lusts. For in accordance with Japanese tradition, the kese would dedicate herself unconditionally to the man who maintained her, and some very close relationships developed, which could definitely be regarded as temporary marriages. In the old Dutch cemetery in Nagasaki, we find proof of this faithfulness on the grave of Janus Reinbout, from the town of Goes in Zealand, who died destitute. His gravestone was paid for without hesitation by his kese, who modestly testified to this fact with an inscription on the side of the stone. Time flies. 3 centuries have flown. The harbor has silted up, and the old Deshima is nothing more than a dotted line on the map. But in the new town, you can see enormous brass nails sunk in the tarmac, indicating prosperity, where the old Deshima used to be. The traces of the Dutch have long since disappeared beneath buildings and busy streets. But the city of Nagasaki is determined to restore the historical inheritance. Whenever any property is vacated within the bounds of the old Deshima, it is bought by the city and demolished, and one of those Dutch East India Company warehouses is already being restored to its former glory. What is now only a scale model, an idea, a sentimental spark in a modern urban district will gradually be transformed into a visible and tangible piece of history. Another tangible piece of history for Japan is the wooden sculpture of the philosopher Erasmus, which traveled on the oceans as the figurehead of the love, and which was saved when the ship foundered in a hurricane on the inland sea to Edo.
Japan is het land van de festivals.
Japan is a country of festivals. There's bound to be a festival somewhere every day. The Okunchi Festival is the biggest yearly event in Nagasaki. But only once every 10 years do the people of Deshima join in with this great festival. It takes years of preparation and a great deal of money to get it all organized. It is obvious that they have their own ideas of the Dutch period on Deshima. The legendary voyage of the Love still appeals to the imagination of the Japanese. To them, this ship symbolizes the start of the long-lasting contacts with the Netherlands. When in the 19th century Japan suddenly joined the ranks of the modern nations, it would have been a chaotic clash of cultures had not the Dutch, for 2 centuries, provided the means and the knowledge for a gradual modernization and westernization of Japan, land of the rising sun.